The icy waters of the Snake River churned with a violence that matched the brewing storm overhead, and Keith Garrison spotted the pale hand reaching up from the current just seconds before it would have disappeared forever beneath the dark surface. He drove his horse into the shallows without thinking, the freezing water immediately soaking through his boots and sending shock waves up his legs. The November cold of 1878 was unforgiving in Idaho territory, and whoever was in that water would not last long. Keith pushed his mare deeper, feeling her resistance against the current, but she was a good horse and trusted him. His rope was already in his hands, years of working cattle making the movements automatic even as his mind raced with the urgency of the moment. The woman's face broke the surface for just a moment, her mouth gasping for air, eyes wide with terror and already glazing with the onset of hypothermia. Keith swung the loop, and by some miracle it landed near enough that her flailing hand caught it. He wrapped the other end around his saddle horn and urged his horse backward, pulling against the weight of the woman, and the river trying to claim her. She came up slowly, her sodden dress dragging her down, but Keith kept the tension steady and his horse kept backing up until he could reach down and grab her arm. With strength born of desperation, he hauled her across his saddle, her body limp and shaking violently. Water poured from her clothes and hair, and her lips had already taken on a dangerous blue tint. Keith did not waste time with questions. His small ranch was only 2 miles from here, and he pushed his horse into a gallop despite the double weight. The woman made small sounds against his leg, barely conscious, and he could feel the cold radiating from her body even through his thick canvas pants. His own teeth were chattering by the time he reached his cabin, the sun dropping behind the mountains and taking what little warmth the day had offered. He dismounted and pulled her down into his arms, surprised by how light she felt. Inside, the cabin was barely warmer, but he had laid a fire that morning that only needed stoking. He set her on the braided rug in front of the fireplace and worked quickly to build up the flames, adding log after log until the fire roared and heat began to fill the small space. The woman was unconscious now, her shaking growing weaker, which Keith knew was a bad sign. He had seen men die from the cold before, knew that the body shutting down was often the last stage. Her dress was plastered to her skin, a plain gray wool that had probably been modest before the river had turned it into a second skin. Keith hesitated only a moment before beginning to work at the tiny buttons running down the front. His fingers were clumsy with cold and the urgency of the situation, but he got it open and peeled the heavy fabric away from her shoulders. Underneath, she wore a simple cotton chemise and corset, both soaked through. Keith grabbed a knife from his belt and cut through the corset laces, not caring about propriety when her life hung in the balance. He wrapped her in every blanket and quilt he owned, then pulled her close to the fire, rubbing her arms and legs through the fabric to try to encourage blood flow. It was only as he worked that he truly looked at her face. She was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with dark hair that hung in wet tangles around her shoulders. Her features were delicate, almost fragile, with high cheekbones and a small nose. Even blue with cold, her lips had a pretty shape. He wondered what color her eyes were, what had brought her to be in that river, whether anyone was looking for her. He kept working, alternating between rubbing her limbs and adding wood to the fire. His own clothes had started to dry, the heat intense now in the small cabin. Steam rose from the woman's skin and hair. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, her eyelids fluttered. Keith leaned closer. "Can you hear me? You are safe now. You are in my cabin." Her eyes opened slowly, and he saw they were a striking gray-green, like the river before a storm. They focused on him with difficulty, confusion and fear warring in their depths. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. He reached for the cup of water he had warmed by the fire and held it to her mouth, letting her take small sips. "Easy now," he said quietly. "You nearly drowned. Do you remember what happened?" She swallowed, wincing as if even that small movement hurt. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and shaking. "Wagon went over, the others are gone." Keith felt his chest tighten. "How many others, my aunt?" "Two families traveling together. The current took them." Her eyes filled with tears that spilled over, tracking down her cold cheeks. "I could not reach them. I tried." He did not know what to say to that, so he just kept his hand on her shoulder, a steady presence. She began to shake again, but this time he thought it was from grief as much as cold. The blankets had slipped down and he pulled them back up, tucking them securely around her. "You need to keep warm. We can talk about this more when you are stronger." She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her fingers like ice against his skin. Her eyes were desperate, boring into his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Let me stay with you," she whispered. "Please, I have nowhere else to go. Let me stay with you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and desperation. Keith looked at this woman he had pulled from the river less than an hour ago, this stranger who was begging him for shelter, and knew his answer before he even opened his mouth. "You can stay," he said simply, "for as long as you need." Her eyes closed and more tears leaked out, but some of the tension left her body. She did not let go of his wrist. Keith stayed there beside her, feeling the cold slowly leave her fingers, watching the color gradually return to her skin. Outside, the storm that had been threatening finally broke, rain hammering against the cabin roof and wind howling through the gaps in the walls. He sent up a silent prayer of thanks that he had ridden along the river when he did, that he had seen that hand reaching up from the water, that he had been able to get her to shore in time. He did not know what he was getting himself into, taking in a woman he did not know, but Keith Garrison had never been one to turn away someone in need. His mother had raised him better than that, even if she had been gone these past 5 years. The ranch was small but profitable enough, and he had plenty of room in the cabin. It would be the decent thing, the right thing, to help her until she could figure out what came next. That was what he told himself as he sat there in the firelight, her hand still clutching his wrist, the storm raging outside. It was just temporary, just until she healed and could make other arrangements. He was being a good neighbor, a decent man, nothing more complicated than that. But as he looked at her face, peaceful now in sleep, something stirred in his chest that felt like more than simple charity. When Keith woke the next morning, stiff from sleeping on the floor beside the fireplace, the first thing he noticed was that the woman was sitting up, the blankets wrapped around her shoulders, staring at the flames. The second thing he noticed was that the storm had passed, weak winter sunlight filtering through the cabin windows. "How are you feeling?" he asked, pushing himself up and wincing at the protest in his back. He was 26 years old, too young to be this sore from one night on the floor. She turned to look at him, and he saw that her face had regained some color, though dark circles hung beneath her eyes. "Better, warmer. Thank you for saving my life. Could not very well let you drown." He stood and moved to the stove, stoking the coals and adding wood. "I will make some coffee and breakfast. You should eat something." "My name is Anna," she said quietly. "Anna Rhodes. I should have told you that last night. Keith Garrison. This is my ranch about 10 miles south of Concord." He filled the coffee pot with water from the bucket and set it on the stove. "You said your wagon went over. Where were you heading?" Anna was quiet for a long moment, her fingers worrying at the edge of the blanket. "Oregon." My aunt and I were traveling with the Morrison family. We were supposed to meet my uncle in Oregon City. He has land there, was going to help us get established. Her voice broke slightly. I do not know how to reach him to tell him what happened. Keith pulled out a pan and began slicing bacon, giving her time to compose herself. The sheriff in Concord will need to know. They will send men down the river to look for the others, see if any survived or if they can recover the bodies for proper burial, and they can help you send a telegram to your uncle. I have no money. The words came out flat. Everything was in the wagon. Our clothes, my aunt's savings, everything. I do not even have a proper dress to wear. He glanced over and saw her jaw set with determination despite the despair in her eyes. She was trying to be strong, not to fall apart, and he respected that. We will figure it out. I have some shirts and pants that might fit you for now. They will be too big, but better than nothing. And do not worry about money right now. You just focus on getting your strength back. The bacon began to sizzle in the pan, filling the cabin with a rich smell that made Keith's stomach growl. He had been so focused on getting Anna warm last night that he had forgotten to eat dinner. He scrambled eggs in another pan and sliced bread from the loaf he had baked 2 days ago, then prepared 2 plates and poured coffee into tin cups. Anna accepted the food with murmured thanks and ate slowly, as if her body was still remembering how to perform basic functions. Keith ate his own breakfast and tried not to stare at her, but it was difficult. In the morning light, dry and wrapped in his quilts, she was pretty in a way that made his chest feel tight. Her dark hair was drying in waves around her shoulders, and those unusual gray-green eyes caught the light from the windows. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, breaking the silence. 5 years. I came out from Missouri after my mother died. My father had already been gone for a decade, and there was nothing keeping me there. I wanted land of my own, a fresh start. He sipped his coffee, the bitter heat welcome. Started with nothing but a horse and determination. Built this cabin myself, bought cattle as I could afford them. It is not much, but it is mine. Anna looked around the cabin with fresh eyes. It was small, just one room with a sleeping area at one end, a kitchen area at the other, and the fireplace in the middle. But it was well built and tidy, everything in its place. You built this yourself, every log and nail. Took me a summer, living in a tent down by the river while I worked. Got some help from neighbors for the roof, but most of it was just me and a lot of sweat. He felt a flush of pride saying it. The cabin might not be fancy, but it represented everything he had accomplished on his own. "It is a good cabin," Anna said softly. She set down her empty plate and cupped the coffee in both hands, breathing in the steam. "You are very kind to let me stay. I meant what I said last night. I have nowhere to go, no family except my uncle in Oregon, and I do not know if I can face that journey again so soon. If you will let me, I would like to stay here and work for my keep. I can cook and clean, help with whatever needs doing around the ranch. I am a hard worker, I promise you that." Keith studied her face, seeing the earnestness there, the desperation barely concealed. She was young and alone in a hard country, and she had just lost her only family. What kind of man would he be if he turned her out? "You can stay as long as you need to. I will not work you like a servant, but if you want to help around the place, I would not say no to decent cooking and someone to keep the cabin clean. I am not much good at either." Relief flooded her features, so profound that Keith felt his throat tighten. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will not be a burden, I swear it." "You are not a burden. You just survived something terrible. Give yourself time to heal." He stood and collected the plates. "I need to ride into Concord today, talk to the sheriff about what happened. You should come with me if you are feeling strong enough. You will need to give a statement, and we can get you some proper clothes." Anna looked down at the blankets wrapped around her. "I do not have anything to wear for the ride." I will find you something. Stay by the fire and keep warm." Keith went to the trunk at the foot of his bed and dug through it until he found an old pair of pants and a shirt that had been too small for him even a few years ago. He had kept them meaning to cut them up for rags, but had never gotten around to it. They would be big on Anna, but with a belt and some creative rolling of cuffs, they might work. He handed them to her along with a pair of wool socks and turned his back to give her privacy to dress. He heard the rustle of fabric, her soft sounds of effort, and then she said, "I am decent." When he turned around, he had to bite back a smile. The pants puddled around her feet, even rolled up, and the shirt hung off her shoulders like a sack, but she had cinched it all with a belt and somehow made it work. Her feet looked tiny in his thick socks. "You look like a scarecrow," he said, then immediately wished he had kept his mouth shut. But Anna laughed, a real laugh that lit up her whole face. "I feel like one too, but at least I am a warm scarecrow." That smile did something to Keith's insides, made them twist up in a way that was both pleasant and deeply unsettling. He cleared his throat and grabbed his hat from the peg by the door. "I will saddle up the horses. Come out when you are ready." Outside, the world sparkled with rainwater, everything clean and fresh washed. Keith breathed deeply, trying to clear his head. He was being ridiculous, getting all twisted up over a woman he had just met. She was vulnerable and grieving, and he needed to keep his thoughts in check. He was helping her because it was the right thing to do, nothing more. He saddled his mare and the older gelding he used as a pack horse, both animals calm and reliable. Anna emerged from the cabin a few minutes later, her wet hair braided back from her face. She looked at the horses with some trepidation. "I am not much of a rider," she admitted. "Buck is gentle as a kitten. He will take care of you." Keith helped her mount, his hands careful on her waist, trying not to think about how small she felt under his hands. Once she was settled, he swung up onto his own horse and they set out toward Concord. The ride took about an hour, following the wagon road that ran parallel to the river for much of the way. Anna rode in silence, her eyes fixed on the rushing water visible through the trees. Keith could only imagine what she was thinking, what memories were playing through her mind. He left her to her thoughts. Concord was a small town, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a scattering of other buildings including the sheriff's office. People stopped to stare as they rode in, curiosity plain on their faces. Keith Garrison was known as a man who kept to himself, and showing up with a woman dressed in men's clothes was bound to cause talk. They tied up outside the sheriff's office, and Keith led the way inside. Sheriff Tom Brennan looked up from his desk, his weathered face breaking into a smile that faded when he saw Anna. "Keith, what brings you to town?" His eyes moved between them. "Is there trouble? This is Anna Rhodes. Her wagon went into the Snake River yesterday evening. I pulled her out, but there were others who did not make it." The sheriff's expression turned grave. He gestured for them to sit and pulled out a notebook. "Miss Rhodes, I am sorry for your loss. Can you tell me what happened?" Anna's voice was steady as she recounted the story. They had been crossing at what they thought was a shallow ford, but the recent rains had swollen the river more than they realized. The current had caught the wagon wheels and pulled them sideways, tipping the whole thing over. She had been thrown clear, but the others, her Aunt Martha Rhodes, John Morrison, his wife Sarah, and their 2 children, had been trapped. She had tried to reach them, but the current was too strong. She had gone under several times herself before Keith had found her downstream. Sheriff Brennan wrote it all down, his face somber. "I will send men out today to search the river. If we find anything, any of the others, we will see they get proper burial. As for your belongings, I suspect most of it is gone, but we will keep an eye out." She needs to send a telegram to her uncle in Oregon City, Keith added. And she needs some clothes and supplies. I will vouch for her at the general store. The sheriff nodded. That should not be a problem. Folks in Concord look after their own. He turned to Anna. You are welcome here, miss. I am truly sorry for your loss. They left the sheriff's office and walked to the general store, Keith acutely aware of the eyes following them. The store was warm and crowded with goods, barrels of flour and sugar, bolts of fabric, tools hanging from the walls. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the store with her husband, came bustling over immediately. Keith Garrison, it has been an age since you came to town. And who is this? Anna Rhodes. She needs some clothes and supplies. I will settle up the bill. Mrs. Henderson's eyes were sharp with curiosity, but she was too polite to ask the questions that Keith could see burning behind them. Of course. Come with me, dear. Let us get you properly outfitted. She swept Anna away toward the back of the store where the women's items were kept, leaving Keith to wander the aisles. He picked up coffee, flour, sugar, cornmeal, dried beans, and a few other staples they were running low on. By the time he had accumulated a decent pile at the counter, Anna and Mrs. Henderson were returning with an armload of clothing. 2 dresses, a skirt and blouses, undergarments, stockings, a coat, boots, and a nightgown, Mrs. Henderson announced. She is set for the winter at least. Keith nodded and reached for his wallet, trying not to wince at the total. It was a significant chunk of his savings, but Anna needed these things, and he could afford it if he was careful. He counted out the bills and coins while Mr. Henderson wrapped everything in brown paper and string. Thank you, Anna said quietly as they loaded the parcels onto the horses. I will pay you back somehow. Do not worry about it. Keith checked the knots on the packages, then helped her mount. Consider it an investment in the ranch. If you are going to help out, you need proper clothes to work in. They stopped at the telegraph office next, and Anna composed a brief message to her uncle explaining what had happened and where she was. Keith paid for that too, then they headed back out of town, the horses loaded down with their purchases. The ride back was quieter than the ride in. Anna seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant. Keith wanted to say something to comfort her but could not find the right words. What did you say to someone who had just lost everything? Instead, he rode in silence, the weight of her grief hanging heavy between them. Back at the cabin, they unloaded the supplies, and Anna immediately disappeared into the corner Keith had pointed out as hers to change into one of her new dresses. When she emerged, she looked transformed. The dress was a simple brown calico, practical and modest, but it fit her properly and made her look like a woman instead of a girl playing dress-up in a man's clothes. Her hair was still damp, but she had pinned it up in a simple style that showed off her graceful neck. Much better, Keith said, then turned away quickly to put the food supplies away before she could see the color rising in his face. The days settled into a routine more quickly than Keith would have expected. Anna proved to be as good as her word about pulling her weight. She woke early and made breakfast, real breakfasts with eggs and bacon and biscuits instead of the burnt bacon and stale bread Keith had been making do with. She cleaned the cabin until it shone, organized his haphazard shelves, and mended the clothes he had been meaning to fix for months. Keith worked the ranch, tending his small herd of cattle, mending fences, cutting firewood for the winter, all the endless tasks that came with keeping a homestead running. He came in each evening to find dinner waiting, the cabin warm and welcoming, Anna quietly going about her tasks. It was domestic and comfortable and utterly terrifying in how right it felt. They talked in the evenings, sitting by the fire after the dishes were done. Keith learned that Anna had grown up in Pennsylvania, that her parents had died in a fever outbreak when she was 15, and she had gone to live with her mother's sister, Aunt Martha. They had lived quietly for 6 years before Martha had gotten the letter from her brother inviting them to Oregon, promising opportunity and a fresh start. Anna had dreams of opening a dress shop someday, of building something of her own. Keith told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father dying in the war and his mother struggling to keep their small farm running. He told her about the wanderlust that had seized him after she died, the need to go somewhere new and make his own way. He talked about the hard first years in Idaho, the struggles and small triumphs that had led to the modest success he enjoyed now. A week passed, then 2. The sheriff sent word that they had recovered 3 bodies downriver, Anna's aunt and 2 of the Morrisons. The other 2 had not been found. There was a funeral in Concord, and Anna stood dry-eyed through the service, her grief too deep for tears. Keith stood beside her, a steady presence, and when it was over, he took her home without a word. December came with bitter cold and the first serious snows. Keith taught Anna how to feed the cattle, how to break the ice on the water troughs, how to bank the fire so it lasted through the night. She was a quick study, unafraid of hard work despite her small size. He found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the way she bit her lip when concentrating, the grace of her hands as she worked, the rare smiles that broke through her grief like sunshine through clouds. He was falling for her. The realization came slowly and then, all at once, hitting him one evening as he watched her knead bread dough at the table, flour dusting her cheeks and a small frown of concentration on her face. He was in love with this woman who had come into his life by accident, who had looked at him with desperate eyes and whispered, "Let me stay with you." He loved her strength and her gentleness, her resilience and her quiet sadness, everything about her. It was complicated and probably foolish. She had only been here a month, was still grieving her aunt and the other losses. She might not feel the same way. She might leave in the spring when the passes were clear, might go to Oregon to find her uncle or back east to the life she had known. The thought of her leaving made Keith's chest ache with a hollowness he had not felt since his mother died. He tried to hide his feelings, to keep things normal and friendly, but it was hard when they lived in such close quarters. Every morning, she braided her hair at the table, and he tried not to watch the repetitive motion of her fingers. Every evening, she sat in the chair across from his, and he tried not to stare at her profile in the firelight. It was sweet torture, having her so close and not being able to touch her the way he wanted. Christmas came, cold and bright. Keith had not celebrated much in recent years, but Anna insisted on making it special. She baked cookies and bread, roasted a chicken, made cranberry sauce from dried berries she had found at the general store on their last trip to town. She even cut pine boughs and arranged them around the cabin, filling the space with the sharp green scent of winter. Keith had gone to town a few days earlier without telling her, and bought a small gift, a set of hair combs with mother-of-pearl inlay that had caught his eye in the general store window. He wrapped them carefully in brown paper and left them on the table Christmas morning. Anna's eyes went wide when she opened them. "Keith, these are beautiful. You should not have spent the money." "I wanted to." He felt awkward suddenly, unsure. "You have done so much around here. Consider it a thank you." She looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her eyes, then stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "Thank you. I love them." The place where her lips had touched burned like a brand. Keith stood frozen as she went to the small mirror hung by the door and carefully placed the combs in her hair. She looked beautiful, the lamplight catching the iridescence of the mother of pearl, and Keith had to turn away before she saw too much on his face. Anna had made him a gift too, a new shirt she had sewn in secret, the stitches small and even. It fit him perfectly, and he wondered when she had measured him, how she had managed without him noticing. He put it on immediately, touched by the care she had taken. They ate their Christmas dinner in comfortable companionship, the cabin warm and filled with good smells. Keith poured them each a small glass of whiskey he had been saving, and they toasted to health and the new year ahead. Anna's cheeks flushed pink from the alcohol, and she laughed more freely than he had heard her laugh in all the weeks she had been here. The sound filled something in Keith he had not even known was empty. That night, lying in his bed in the darkness with Anna asleep in her corner, Keith made a decision. He would tell her how he felt. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. She deserved to know, and he deserved to stop living in this limbo of wanting and not having. If she did not feel the same way if she wanted to leave, at least he would know. At least he would have tried. The new year of 1879 arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days, trapping them in the cabin. They played cards, read from the few books Keith owned, talked for hours about everything and nothing. Anna told him about a boy she had loved when she was 17, who had died in a factory accident before they could marry. Keith told her about the loneliness of the last 5 years, about the nights when the silence was so complete it felt like drowning. "I used to think I liked being alone," he admitted, staring into the fire. "Thought it was simpler, not having to worry about anyone but myself. But this winter, having you here, it has reminded me what I was missing." Anna was quiet for a moment, her knitting needles clicking softly. "I was afraid when I first came here," she said finally. "Not of you, but of being a burden, of wearing out my welcome. But you have made me feel like this is home. I have not had that feeling since my parents died." Keith looked at her across the flickering firelight. "You could stay. Not just until spring, but for as long as you want. Permanently, even." She met his eyes, her needles stilling. "What are you saying, Keith?" His heart hammered in his chest, but he made himself continue. "I am saying that I have grown attached to you being here. More than attached. I care about you, Anna. I think about you all the time, and the thought of you leaving makes me feel like someone is reaching into my chest and squeezing. I know it has not been very long, and maybe it is too soon, but I needed you to know." Anna set her knitting aside carefully, her face unreadable. Keith braced himself for rejection, for her to say kindly that she did not feel the same way, that she was grateful for his help but nothing more. Instead, she stood and crossed the small space between them, kneeling beside his chair. "Keith, look at me." He did, and was startled by the intensity in her gray-green eyes. "I care about you too," she said quietly. "I have been trying not to, trying to keep some distance because I did not want to assume anything, did not want to take advantage of your kindness. But the truth is, I wake up thinking about you. I watch for you to come in from working, and my whole day feels brighter when you smile at me. When you are near, I feel safe in a way I have not felt since my father was alive." Keith reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hand. Her skin was soft and warm, and she leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough. "Please," she whispered. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, gentle at first, testing. She made a small sound and her hands came up to grip his shoulders, and then the kiss deepened into something that made Keith's head spin. She tasted like the peppermint tea she had been drinking, and her lips were soft and eager under his. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," Keith admitted, his forehead resting against hers. Anna laughed shakily. "I have wanted you to." They stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing each other in, the fire crackling beside them and the wind howling outside. Then Anna pulled back slightly, her expression turning serious. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Anything. Are you asking me to stay because you want me as your housekeeper who you occasionally kiss, or are you asking me to stay as your wife?" The directness of the question caught Keith off guard, but he appreciated it. Anna had never been one to play games or dance around difficult subjects. It was one of the things he loved about her. "I am asking you to stay as my wife," he said clearly. "If you will have me, I know I do not have much to offer. The ranch is small and the work is hard and winters out here are brutal, but I would spend every day trying to make you happy. I would cherish you and provide for you and stand by your side through whatever comes. I love you, Anna. I think I have loved you since you grabbed my wrist that first night and asked me to let you stay." Tears spilled down Anna's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, I will marry you. I love you too, Keith. You saved my life in more ways than one, and I cannot imagine a future that does not have you in it." Keith pulled her up into his lap and kissed her again, deeper this time, pouring everything he felt into it. She fit against him perfectly, her arms around his neck, and he thought that this was what had been missing from his life. Not just a woman, but this woman, Anna, who was strong and gentle and brave and entirely her own person. She had chosen him just as he had chosen her, and that made it mean something. They sat together in the firelight for hours, talking about the future, making plans. They would marry as soon as the weather cleared enough to get to town. Keith would add on to the cabin in the spring, make it bigger, maybe add a separate bedroom. They would build the ranch together, maybe buy more land, more cattle. Anna still wanted her dress shop, and Keith promised they would figure out a way to make that happen. Maybe in a few years, when they were more established, they could open a place in Concord. The blizzard finally broke 3 days later, and Keith made the trip to Concord alone to speak with Reverend Mitchell about a wedding. The Reverend was an older man with kind eyes who had presided over the funeral for Anna's aunt. He agreed readily to perform the ceremony, and suggested they do it the following Sunday, giving time for the word to spread so that anyone from town who wanted to attend could do so. Keith also stopped at the general store and bought a simple gold band for Anna, the best he could afford. Mrs. Henderson's eyes went wide when she realized what he was asking for, and she practically glowed with excitement. "I knew something was going on," she declared. "A woman does not just move in with a bachelor without something developing. Good for you, Keith. She is a lovely girl, and you deserve some happiness." The week leading up to the wedding was a flurry of activity. Anna made herself a new dress from fabric she had bought back in December, a deep blue that brought out her eyes. Keith gave the cabin the most thorough cleaning of its life, and even built a new bed frame for what would become their shared bed. He felt nervous and excited in equal measure, barely able to believe this was happening. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue. They rode to Concord together, Anna in her new dress with her hair carefully arranged using the combs Keith had given her for Christmas. She looked beautiful enough to take his breath away, and he told her so, making her blush and smile. The church was surprisingly full when they arrived. Apparently Mrs. Henderson had spread the word far and wide, and half the town had turned out to see the wedding. Keith recognized neighbors and ranchers he did business with, townspeople he barely knew, all there to witness this moment. It touched him more than he expected. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Keith spoke his vows clearly, promising to love and honor Anna for all his days, and she responded in kind, her voice steady despite the tears shining in her eyes. He slipped the gold band onto her finger, and she looked at it with wonder, as if she could not quite believe it was real. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Mitchell declared with a smile. "Keith, you may kiss your bride." Keith did so gladly, cupping Anna's face in his hands and kissing her soundly. The small congregation erupted in applause and cheers, and when they pulled apart, Anna was laughing through her tears. The church ladies had organized a small reception in the community hall, complete with cake and coffee, and far too much well-meaning advice for the newlyweds. Keith endured it with good humor, keeping Anna close to his side, his hand at the small of her back. She chatted easily with the women, already making connections in the community, and Keith felt a swell of pride watching her. She would make a good life here. They would make a good life together. As the sun began to set, they made their excuses and headed home, both of them eager to be alone. The ride back seemed to take forever, anticipation making Keith's hands unsteady on the reins. Anna kept glancing at him, her cheeks pink, and he knew she felt it too, this crackling awareness between them. The cabin was warm when they entered, the fire Keith had banked that morning still giving off heat. He lit lamps while Anna removed her coat and boots, suddenly feeling shy despite everything they had already shared. They were married now, truly bound to each other, and the weight of that felt momentous. Anna came to him where he stood by the table, still holding the match he had used to light the last lamp. She took it gently from his fingers and blew it out, then reached up to frame his face with her hands. "Hello, husband," she said softly. "Hello, wife," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. She stood on her toes and kissed him, and Keith wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. The kiss deepened and heated. Months of restrained want finally allowed free rein. Keith's hands roamed over her back, feeling the shape of her through the fabric of her dress, and Anna made small sounds of encouragement that drove him wild. "Bedroom," he managed to gasp out when they broke apart for air. "Yes," she agreed, slightly breathless. Keith swept her up into his arms, making her laugh with delight, and carried her to the bed he had built. He set her down gently and then followed her down, kissing her until they were both dizzy with it. They learned each other slowly that night, with tenderness and care, and Keith thought he had never known such completeness as he found in Anna's arms. Winter gave way to spring, the snow melting and the world turning green again. Keith worked to expand the cabin, adding 2 rooms onto the back with help from some of the neighboring ranchers. Anna planted a garden, rows of vegetables and herbs that she tended carefully. The cattle thrived and Keith was able to buy several more head, slowly building up the herd. Anna received a letter from her uncle in Oregon, expressing his sorrow over what had happened and his relief that she had survived and found happiness. He sent a small sum of money as a wedding gift, which Anna promptly put toward fabric and supplies for the dress shop she still dreamed of opening. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. They worked hard during the days and fell into each other's arms at night, the passion between them never seeming to fade. Keith had never been so happy, never felt so content with his life. Coming home each evening to Anna waiting was a joy that never got old. In early summer, Anna told him she was pregnant. Keith picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children, and that night he held her close and whispered plans for the future to her in the darkness. They would need to build a proper house, he decided. The cabin was fine for 2 but would be cramped with a baby. They would need more income too, which meant expanding the ranch, maybe hiring some help. "We will figure it out," Anna said, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Together we can do anything." Keith believed her. They had already survived so much, built so much from nothing. A baby would be a blessing, not a burden. True to his word, Keith began building a house that summer, a real one with multiple rooms and a proper kitchen for Anna. The neighboring ranchers came to help with the heavy work, and by autumn, it stood complete, sturdy and spacious. They moved their belongings from the cabin, which Keith planned to convert into a bunkhouse for hired hands once they could afford to hire them. Anna's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though she was sick most mornings in the early months. Keith fretted over her constantly until she laughingly told him she was not made of glass and would not break. She continued to work in her garden and around the house, though Keith took over all the heavy chores. In late February of 1880, on a snowy night that reminded Keith eerily of the night they had met, Anna went into labor. Mrs. Henderson came out from town to help, having served as midwife to half the babies born in the area. Keith was banished to the main room while the women worked, and he paced like a caged animal, jumping at every sound from the bedroom. It seemed to take forever, but finally, just as dawn was breaking, he heard the thin wail of a newborn. Keith's legs went weak with relief. A few minutes later, Mrs. Henderson emerged, smiling tiredly. "You have a son, Keith, a healthy baby boy," and Anna came through it like a trooper. "You can go in now." Keith stumbled into the bedroom to find Anna propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up at him with so much love that it made his throat tight. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Keith sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby. He was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. Keith reached out with one finger and touched the impossibly small hand, and the baby's fingers immediately curled around it, gripping tight. "He is perfect," Keith whispered, awed. "You are amazing. I love you so much. I love you too." Anna leaned her head against his shoulder. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names over the past months, but had not decided on anything definite. Keith looked at his son, this tiny person who was half him and half Anna, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. This child would carry the name Keith chose into the world, would grow up to be his own person. "Thomas," he said finally. "After my father, Thomas Martin Garrison." Anna smiled. "Thomas, I like that. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world." The baby made a small sound, and they both laughed quietly. Mrs. Henderson bustled in to check on them, pronounced everyone healthy, and gave Keith a list of instructions for caring for Anna over the next few weeks. Then she departed, leaving the new family alone together. Keith stayed home from working the ranch for the next week, unable to tear himself away from Anna and the baby. He watched in fascination as Anna fed Thomas, as she changed his tiny clothes, as she rocked him to sleep. He learned to hold his son properly, to support the wobbling head, to recognize the different cries that meant hunger or discomfort or tiredness. It was exhausting and overwhelming, and the best thing he had ever experienced. As Thomas grew, the ranch continued to thrive. Keith hired 2 hands to help with the expanding herd, and Anna finally opened her dress shop in Concord, working from home when Thomas was tiny and eventually renting a small space on the main street as he got older. She had a good eye for fashion and was skilled with a needle, and soon women were coming from farms and ranches all around to have her make their dresses. The years passed in a blur of work and love and family. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn determination. When he was 3, Anna gave birth to a daughter they named Caroline, a sweet-tempered baby who wrapped Keith around her tiny finger from the first moment. 2 years after that came another son, James, who was loud and rambunctious from birth. The house filled with the sounds of children playing and laughing. Keith expanded the ranch until it was one of the most successful in the area, with a good-sized herd and contracts to supply beef to several towns. Anna's dress shop became a fixture in Concord, and she took on an assistant to help with the workload. Through it all, Keith never forgot that night in November 1878 when he had pulled a freezing woman from the river. He never forgot the way Anna had looked at him with desperate, determined eyes and whispered, "Let me stay with you." He had let her stay, and she had given him everything, a life fuller and richer than he had ever imagined possible. They celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary in 1889 with a party at the ranch, half the county in attendance. Keith watched Anna move through the crowd, chatting easily with neighbors and friends, their 3 children running around underfoot. She had long since stopped wearing grief like a cloak, though Keith knew she still thought of her aunt and the others who had died that day. She had built a memorial for them in the Concord Cemetery, a simple stone that bore their names, but she had built a life too, had chosen to keep living and loving instead of letting tragedy define her. Keith admired that strength more than he could say. That night, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Keith and Anna sat on the porch of their house, watching the stars come out over the mountains. He held her hand, his thumb rubbing over the gold band she still wore. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going to Oregon, building a life with me instead of with your uncle?" Anna turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight from inside. "Never. Not for a single moment. You gave me a home when I had none, loved me when I felt broken. You gave me children and a purpose and a partner in every sense of the word. This life we have built together is more than I ever dreamed of having." "I was just thinking," Keith said, "about that night I found you. If I had ridden a different direction, if I had been 5 minutes later, if any one of a dozen things had been different, you would not be here. We would not be here. But you did not ride a different direction. You were exactly where you needed to be when you needed to be there. I believe that was meant to happen, that we were meant to find each other." Anna squeezed his hand. "I whispered, 'Let me stay with you,' and you said yes. That simple choice changed both our lives." "Best decision I ever made," Keith said gruffly. "Mine too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the night deepen around them. Inside, one of the children called out in their sleep and then went quiet again. The familiar sounds of their home, their life, surrounded them. Keith thought about the young man he had been when he came to Idaho, alone and determined to prove himself. He had built a ranch and made a success of it, but he had been lonely even if he had not wanted to admit it. Then Anna had come into his life like a storm, turning everything upside down in the best possible way. She had stayed with him, just as she had asked. And in staying, she had shown him what it meant to truly live, not just survive. She had given him love and family, and a future that stretched bright before them. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing new challenges and joys. The children grew, Thomas taking an interest in ranching and working alongside Keith from a young age, Caroline showing her mother's talent for sewing and design, James proving to have a head for numbers that suggested he might go into business someday. Keith's hair began to show gray at the temples, and Anna laughed and said it made him look distinguished. Her own dark hair stayed mostly dark, just a few silver threads showing by the time their 20th anniversary rolled around. The lines around her eyes deepened, but Keith thought she was more beautiful at 40 than she had been at 22. They faced hardships too. A drought year that nearly broke the ranch, a winter when James came down with pneumonia, and they spent terrified weeks nursing him back to health. The slow decline and death of Keith's faithful mare who had pulled Anna from the river so long ago. Through it all, they faced things together, leaning on each other's strength when their own faltered. More grandchildren came as their own children grew and married. Thomas wed a rancher's daughter and gave them 3 grandsons who loved nothing more than helping their grandfather with the cattle. Caroline married a doctor and moved to Boise, though she visited often with her 2 daughters. James surprised them all by going to school back east, though he promised he would return to Idaho eventually. Keith and Anna moved into their 50s and then their 60s. The ranch passed primarily to Thomas's capable hands, though Keith still helped out when he could. Anna finally retired from the dress shop, though she still took on special projects for longtime customers. They spent more time on the porch, watching the world turn around them, content in the life they had built. On a warm evening in the summer of 1910, 32 years after they had met, Keith and Anna sat in their usual spots on the porch, rocking chairs creaking gently. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Thomas and his wife were inside preparing dinner. "Quite a legacy we have made," Keith said, gesturing to the scene before them. The ranch sprawled in all directions, prosperous and well-maintained. The house had been expanded and improved over the years. The dress shop in town bore Anna's name and was now run by Caroline's oldest daughter. "We have been blessed," Anna agreed. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "Sometimes I still cannot believe how it all started, how much has grown from that one terrible, wonderful night." Keith lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his lips gentle against her soft skin. "You whispered, 'Let me stay with you,' and changed my entire world. You said yes and gave me a reason to keep living. We saved each other, I think." Keith thought about that and realized it was true. He had pulled her from the river, but she had pulled him from the loneliness that had been drowning him just as surely as the water had threatened her. They had saved each other and then built something beautiful together. "No regrets?" he asked, the same question he had posed decades ago. "Not a single one," Anna said firmly. "I would live it all again, every moment, every challenge, every joy, just to end up here with you." "Me too," Keith said softly. "Every time I would choose you." They sat together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The air was warm and sweet with the scent of Anna's roses growing along the porch rail. Their grandchildren's laughter rang out like bells. Inside, their son and daughter-in-law moved around the kitchen, preparing a meal they would all share together. Keith looked at the woman beside him, this woman he had pulled from a freezing river a lifetime ago, who had become his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in everything. Her profile was as dear to him now as it had been that first night when he had watched her sleep by his fire, her hand clutching his wrist like a lifeline. "I love you," he said, needing her to hear it again even though he had said it thousands of times over the years. Anna turned to him with a smile that still made his heart skip a beat. "I love you too, always and forever." As the stars began to emerge overhead and their family called them in for dinner, Keith thought about the twists of fate that had brought them together. A wagon going into a river at just the wrong moment, or perhaps the right one. A cowboy riding along the bank at precisely the time he was needed. A desperate plea and a simple yes that had changed two lives completely. He had let her stay with him, and in doing so, had found everything he had been missing without even knowing he was looking for it. Love, family, partnership, purpose. A life that was full and rich and meaningful in ways his solitary existence never could have been. Keith stood and offered Anna his hand, pulling her gently to her feet. They walked into the house together, ready for the evening meal surrounded by the family they had created, the legacy they would leave behind. The door closed softly behind them, shutting out the coming night, and the house glowed with lamplight and warmth and love. The story that had begun in darkness and cold and desperation had become one of light and warmth and joy. From that single moment of connection, of one person reaching out and another responding with open hands and an open heart, an entire life had bloomed. Not a perfect life, because no life ever was, but a good one. A life built on love and trust, and the simple courage it took to whisper, "Let me stay with you," and to answer, "You can stay." And Anna had stayed, through 32 years of seasons changing and children growing and hair turning gray, through hardship and triumph, and the quiet daily moments that made up a life. She had stayed, and Keith had never stopped being grateful for that first yes, had never stopped marveling at the gift she had been and continued to be. Their love story had started with ice and water and desperation, but it had grown into something warm and enduring, something that would outlast them both in the children and grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. It was a love story like the best ones, not perfect but real, not easy but worth every struggle, not simple but profound in its depth and meaning. As they took their places at the dinner table, surrounded by the noisy, chaotic love of their family, Keith caught Anna's eye across the table. She smiled at him, that same smile that had stolen his heart all those years ago, and he smiled back. No words were needed. They both knew what they had, understood the precious rarity of finding someone who completed you so thoroughly that life before them seemed like a pale shadow of what life could be. The meal was served, laughter rose and fell around the table, and Keith held Anna's hand beneath the tablecloth, his thumb tracing the gold band she still wore. It was just another evening in a long line of evenings, unremarkable in many ways, but Keith recognized it for what it was. Another moment of grace in a life that had been full of them since the night he had pulled a freezing woman from the Snake River, and she had changed his world forever with 5 simple words. "Let me stay with you." He had let her stay, and she had brought him more happiness than he had known existed. That was the real miracle of their story, not the dramatic rescue or the quick courtship, but the way they had built a life together day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment. The way they had chosen each other over and over again through the years, until the choosing was as natural as breathing. As the evening wound down and their family began to disperse to their own homes, Keith and Anna walked out onto the porch one last time before bed. The night was peaceful, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. An owl hooted in the distance and the horses moved restlessly in the barn. "Another good day," Anna said, leaning against Keith's shoulder. "Another good day," he agreed, wrapping his arm around her waist. "And tomorrow will be another one, and the day after that. As long as I have you, every day is good." "Such a romantic," she teased, but her voice was warm with affection. "Only for you," he replied, and it was true. Anna had unlocked something in him he had not known existed, a capacity for tenderness and devotion that had surprised him as much as anyone. They stood there a while longer, reluctant to end the day, before finally heading inside to their bedroom. The house was quiet now, just the two of them, and it felt right. Keith helped Anna with the buttons on her dress that her arthritic fingers struggled with now, and she helped him pull off his boots. They prepared for bed with the easy familiarity of decades together, climbing under the quilts that Anna had made with her own hands. Keith pulled her close, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand over his heart. This was how they slept most nights, tangled together, reluctant to be separated even in sleep. "Keith," Anna's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes. Thank you for saying yes that night, for letting me stay." Keith kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Thank you for asking. Thank you for staying. Thank you for everything you have given me." "We gave each other everything," Anna said. "That is what love is." She was right, as she so often was. They had given each other everything that mattered, built a life and a family from nothing but determination and love. What more could anyone ask for? Keith closed his eyes. Anna's breathing evening out as she drifted to sleep. He stayed awake a little longer, listening to the sounds of the house settling around them, thinking about the impossible series of events that had brought them to this moment. So much had to go exactly right for them to find each other. A wagon in a river, a cowboy on a horse, a desperate plea and a generous answer. But it had happened. Against all odds, they had found each other, had built this beautiful life together. And now, in their later years with their children grown and their grandchildren growing, they could look back and know that it had all been worth it. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt or fear had been worth it for the love they had found together. Keith drifted to sleep finally, his wife safe in his arms, his heart full, his life complete. The cowboy who had pulled a freezing woman from the river had found not just a wife, but a soulmate, a partner, the missing piece of his heart he had not even known he was searching for. And the woman who had whispered, "Let me stay with you," had found a home, not just a physical place but a person who made her feel safe and cherished and loved beyond measure. She had stayed, and in staying, had created a legacy of love that would echo through generations. Their story had a happy ending, the kind that did not come in a single moment but was built slowly over years of choosing each other, of working together, of loving through good times and bad. It was the kind of ending that was really just another beginning, because their love would live on in their children and grandchildren, in the stories told about them, in the house and ranch and business they had built together. The cowboy had pulled the woman from the river, and she had pulled him into a life fuller and richer than either had imagined possible. They had saved each other and loved each other and built something lasting together. And that was how their story ended, with love and family and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived together. No cliffhangers, no unanswered questions, just the peace of two people who had found each other against all odds and had made their happiness last a lifetime. It was exactly the ending they deserved, and exactly the ending they had worked so hard to create. Happy and complete and full of love, with every thread tied off and every promise kept. They had started with nothing but each other, and in the end, they had discovered that was all they had ever needed. The cowboy and the woman from the river lived out their days together, growing old side by side, never regretting the choices that had brought them together, never taking for granted the precious gift of their love. And when their time finally came, many years later, they went knowing they had lived fully and loved deeply, leaving behind a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was a love story for the ages, born from desperation and luck, and the simple human courage to reach out for help, and to answer that call with an open heart. From that single moment of connection had grown a lifetime of joy, proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, and that true love, once found, can weather any storm and last forever.